Hi, I'm Meredith, and today I've got 4 more stencil spinning techniques that ended up making 5 Christmas cards and some tags. I used the Stencils 360 tool for these techniques, and they build on my previous videos with this tool, so I'll link those down below for you. Let's get spinning. My first technique is kind of a combo demonstration. It's a 2-for-1 design that I'll use to make slimline cards. I'm using black ink so that I can do some Copic coloring, and it's also the easiest way to get a different look with any of the 360 round stencils. Each stencil has a little symbol cut out at the edge. This helps you line up the stencil, but it also tells you which marking on the tool to use to get the look that the designer intended. And if you know me at all, you know that I love to do exactly what the designer did not intend, and it's so easy to just turn any of the stencils the number of times you want, rather than just following the symbols. I'm using one of the stencils from the Sacred Lotus set, and I'm turning it at every 15-degree line. This will give me 24 petals, which makes for a nice full design. Since this design goes close to the edge of the stencil, I tape over the little heart guide so I won't end up with unintentional ink blending. I'm using Gina Obsidian ink, which is Copic friendly, so that I can color the design I get to make a Christmas wreath. For my blending, I'm using the small Altenew blending brushes. I have used sponge daubers in the past, and I like how they work with small stencil areas, but I thought I would give these brushes a try since I find that bristles often stand up better to stenciling than foams, which can get damaged when they catch on the edges. After 12 turns, I get this really cool spirograph type image. This is on an 8x8 inch panel of white cardstock, so the design really is quite big, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. First, I have a little coloring to do. I won't bore you with all of it, since I did no blending. I just chose different shades of green for the various rows of shapes. I started with a lighter yellow-green marker on the outside, and I worked my way darker as I moved in. Then I did a row of red to add a pop of contrast, before working my way back out from darkest to lightest green. I left the center white for now, and we'll revisit that in a moment. This 8x8 inch square could be cut into 4 4x4 squares, or you could use an 8.5 by 7 inch panel and just fold it in half for a fun 1-layer slimline card with the design on the front and the back. But I chose to use some slimline dies from a Jillian Vance design, and I trimmed it into 2 panels. To add some interest, I used one of Jillian's stitch dot inside and out circles to cut out the center portion of the wreaths. This gave that inside edge of the wreath a more finished look, and it gave me the opportunity to color the rest of it green. To go with the very cool and graphic look, I chose a simple Merry Christmas sentiment from Ellen Hudson, and I stamped it with VersaFine Onyx ink at the bottom. Just to show you some options, I put one of the wreaths on a black slimline card base and one on white, and I added a few silver jewels from Pretty Pink Posh for some sparkle. Which one do you like better? Let me know in the comments below. The next technique is probably the most complicated, but only because it involves some math. And don't worry, I have a cheat sheet, so you can leave the calculating to me. The Stencils 360 tool base has these symbols on it along with the angle measurements. First up, I added some tape so that I can easily tell how many petals or images I'll get with each angle. If you like this idea, just pause here so you can copy it down and add this to your tool. With all these markings, you can do 2s, 3s, 4s, 6s, and 12s, but there's no multiples of 5, so I thought I would try to figure that out. I started with my math and I divided 360 by 5 to figure out the angle measurement. Spoiler alert, it's 72. Then I added 72 to 72 to come up with the numbers from 0 to 360. I won't show you the real-time portion of that because it's embarrassingly slow, especially for an accountant. Once I had the numbers, I had to figure out a way to determine where those numbers are on the tool. I used the markings that are already there to estimate it. For instance, I know where 90 degrees is. It has a square on it. And I know that the squares are 15 degrees apart, so the heart before 90 is at 75. I put a mark with a black Sharpie just to the left of that heart mark to estimate 72. I used this method to continue around the base until I had all 5 marked. I did make a mistake at one point and I used some hand sanitizer to remove the black Sharpie. Okay, so now it's done. What can I do with this? I quickly made a daisy with it using the smallest Sacred Lotus stencil, but I really couldn't tell the difference between a 10-petal daisy and a 12-petal daisy. Can you tell the difference? I had a quick think and I got out this stencil from the fireworks set. This time, as I worked my way around, I only blended ink through one side of the stencil, so I'll truly only get 5 sets of fireworks. I think that will make it more obvious. Next, I cut my own stencil with this memory box star die, and I positioned it so that the arms of the star are in between my fireworks bursts. I blended some yellow ink through, going heavier at the outside edges and letting it fade in the center. Then I got out an older Neat and Tangled sentiment, and I used my Misty to stamp it with Juniper Mist ink, which is a nice dark navy blue. To finish this glorious card, I put navy blue on the card base, and I trimmed the panel so I would just have a narrow frame around it. I didn't want to cut off too much of the rays. I added some dots of stickles in between the rays for some sparkle. The next two techniques go back to the question that I still get the most often about this tool, which is whether you can use it with 6-inch square stencils. The answer is yes, but it's a little more complicated than that. The success of this technique really depends on which stencil you use, and I talked a little bit about this in my previous video, and I'll expand a bit more here. First, this Snowflake stencil, which is from Penguin Palace, is a really good candidate because it has a random pattern on it, and there's quite a bit of space between the snowflakes. I'm hoping this means I'll get a visually pleasing blizzard without too much overlap. To turn the 6-inch stencil, I used the 6-inch paper guide, and I put tape down on all 4 edges so I won't get any ink between the stencil and the guide as I blend. As I put the light blue ink down, you can get a better idea of where the snowflakes are and how much space there is between them. I'm turning this only 4 times, but you could definitely experiment with your own stencils and see whether you like the results. I moved on to Sweet 16, which is a pale purple, and then I cleaned the stencil before turning and blending my third color, Mint to Be. For my fourth turn, rather than another color of ink, I used some Nouveau Glimmer paste in Moonstone, which is clear and oh so sparkly. I cleaned the stencil again, and then I used a palette knife to put the paste through the snowflake holes. I'm not sure if you can see it clearly here, but sometimes I have trouble lifting the guides out of the base, so I added some orange washi tape to the edge to give me a little handle to pull on, and that makes it a lot easier. Here's the finished piece, and I love how it looks. I wanted to get as much as I could out of this, as well as using as much of it as possible. I started by creating tags using an Ellen Hudson tag die and cutting them so that I included some white space on them. This allowed me to get 2 tags from just one side of the panel. I used a simple Lawn Fawn Merry Christmas and some ribbon to finish them. And that left me with a piece that was about 3 inches by 6 inches. I trimmed it into 3 6-inch strips, trimmed them down to 4 inches long, and then popped them up on a card. I added some stickles to the edges of the strips for even more sparkle. Now this next card almost didn't make it into this video. It was an experiment, and as you'll see, it got pretty ugly before it ended up being maybe my favorite. It's another way to use 6-inch square stencils. The last one was a random pattern, and this one is an ordered pattern. But the idea is to use only part of it to create something else. So I started by taping the stencil onto the 6-inch paper guide, as well as masking off all the holes I didn't want. This was dumb. I really did not need all this tape, and it actually caused me some trouble because it stuck through the stencil to the paper below. That forced me to lift it up each time I wanted to turn it, which really isn't the point of the tool. I filmed these cards out of order, so it was really this issue that helped me figure out the trick of adding tape to the edge of the guide to act as a handle. Anyway, I filled in one circle with lime Ricky ink, and then I turned it 8 times. This time I am using the little sponge daubers because they allow me to kind of circle around the outside of the hole and create dimension by leaving the center lighter. Before I moved on, I repositioned the stencil, and I did the same thing to fill in the gaps, creating some overlap and a wreath that was more full. Next, I grabbed another stencil with rows of circles, but these ones are quite a bit smaller. This time I taped around the edges and then just around the 3 dots I used to create some berries on my wreath. I chose Samba, which is a nice bright red that I hoped would show up against the green. At this point I had a nice wreath, but I thought it would be fun to fill it in with more and create one of those wreaths that has all the baubles all over the place. So I grabbed yet another circle background stencil, masked one off, and I turned it with some Aquatini ink. Then I turned it with some grass skirt ink. Now I'm really hating it. But here's a great tip. If you're hating what you're working on, keep going for a little while. You might make it worse, but you hated it anyway, so that's no loss. I was starting to get like a spaceship vibe at this point, and I figured again I would just continue on. It can't get any worse, but it just might get better. I gave up on the turning and I went in freehand. Generally, I like order and pattern, but desperate times call for desperate measures, and I freehanded the last few circles, filling in the bald patches until I actually ended up really liking it. And trust me, no one was as surprised as I was. For my sentiment, I got out my foil press to do some hot foiling. It's been a hot minute, get it? Since I used this, and I had to refresh my memory and do a test run, but it all came back to me. First, heat up the press, set the timer, and put your foil stamp onto the purple mat. Then put the foil on top, pretty side down, and put your cardstock on top of that. I'm using one of the brand new foil stamps from Ellen Hudson. It has a fun scripty font that works well with my bubble wreath. Next, add the top plate and start the countdown to get everything toasty warm, and then run it through your Gemini Junior. Remove the foil and remember how amazing foiling is. Make a mental note to use this method more often. Christmas is the perfect time to get glitzy with this tool. I hope you enjoyed watching these techniques. These projects were all Christmas themed, but of course these techniques will work all year long. You can try them with stencils you have at home. As promised, I'm linking here to my Stencils 360 playlist so you can go back and watch lots of examples, from the very basics to the more stepped up examples. And if you're starting to panic because it's the end of November and you really need to get cracking on your Christmas cards, I've linked to my Making Multiples playlist, which is filled with loads of tips. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.